Great. I'm going to apologize in advance. In order to keep this in the 15 to 20 minutes that everybody would like it to stay in, I have to read it. So I apologize for putting you to sleep now, but I'll just start taking off. If we define the term revolution as an event that signifies fundamental change in a governing system, there were, of course, two revolutions in 1917. One that moved Imperial Russia from an absolutist monarchic system to a system run by the elites of the Russian legislature, a weak parliamentary system, and one that moved Russia from a weak parliamentary system to that of its proponents hoped, socialism. Both groups faced, however, significant problems in 1917. A poorly run war that bred corruption and inflation, a small and heavily oppressed working class, nationalities and minorities that eagerly wished to escape the tyrannical rule of the Russian Orthodox majority, a nation of peasants that produced and consumed little, and an entrenched bureaucracy that resisted any fundamental change. Unfortunately, we can't really go into great depth on each topic in the lecture. However, afterwards, the discussion, if you have any questions, of course, I'm more than happy to answer them. When the Bolsheviks seized power in November 1917, they're October, so that's why you see sometimes it called the October Revolution, sometimes the November Revolution, they had not been neutral on these issues. The Bolsheviks had fully supported Order Number 1, issued in March, that said elected committees should run military units and that officers should not command except during tactical operations. Order Number 1 came not through the provisional government that was made up of Duma elites, but it came from the Petrograd Soviet of People's Deputies of Workers and Soldiers. Later peasants were added, which was the shadow government run by Mensheviks, Bolsheviks, SRE, and other revolutionaries. Many soldiers, of course, accepted Order Number 1 because either they did not want to listen to incompetent commanders, of which there were many, who threw them into useless battles, or workers in the army were more willing to listen to Mensheviks and Bolsheviks than to a military run by princes and large businessmen, particularly when those princes and large businessmen were encouraging the inflation that was bankrupting their families. By late July 1917, the Bolsheviks had wrested control of the Petrograd Soviet from the Mensheviks and Right SRE, and in November they eradicated rank, further encouraging soldiers and sailors to resist orders coming from monarchic and bourgeois sources. The soldiers were happy to comply. Many of them simply wanted to go home. Unfortunately, the chaos spread by the military having two masters, that is, the old system as well as the new system. In any revolution, you do not have a clear divide, of course. This did not translate into better living conditions for soldiers or civilians immediately. The Russian army found itself continually in retreat as poorly trained peasants and workers replaced poorly trained Tsarist officers, if the peasants and workers remained in the army at all. The Russian Navy was all but sunk. The German Navy was far superior to the Russian Navy. Even the Turkish Navy had success against the Russian Navy, and that's very sad. By July 1917, 7 million men had deserted the military, though many of the men deserted multiple times. So of that 7 million, that's not single men, but in many cases multiple desertions. The strain put upon those who remained was immense. Casualties piled up, soldiers fragged officers, whether Bolshevik, Menshevik, or Tsarist, and many Russians turned on their own populations. It was not uncommon for the Russian army, as it retreated, to rape and pillage the villages with which it came in contact. So much so that minorities often claimed that the Germans were better at treating them civilly than the Russian army was. That's not good. While the parliamentarians promised democracy and the Bolsheviks promised peace, land, and bread, many soldiers and sailors found the Bolsheviks more convincing. Their slogan promised more immediate and concrete benefits. In November, when Lenin declared peace with all nations, many soldiers became convinced that the war would end soon, and even more returned home, much to the Germans' happiness, who continued, of course, to move eastward. The military's demand for food, materiel, and other supplies, however, continued to stress Russia's weak industrial system. Industrial workers represented about 2% of Russia's 165 million people. Hours were long, pay was low. An 80-hour work week with pay for only 40 or 60 hours was not unusual. War-related inflation had raised the price of food, fuel, and even living space, resulting in a near-starvation existence for most workers and their families. Even though the provisional government had legislated 8-hour workdays and a raise in the minimum wage, Most large industrialists ignored the government and continued to exploit their workers. While the majority of workers did not support the Mensheviks or the Bolsheviks, they didn't support anyone in particular. They were willing to support anyone who offered them better living conditions. By November, Lenin had declared a peace, the war continued, nationalized all lands belonging to the Russian Orthodox Church, the crown, and the nobility, and instituted workers' control in factories, fulfilling demands of many of the workers who were one generation removed from the peasantry, heavily crushed by the burdens of an industrialized war, and starving. Workers were willing to accept the Bolsheviks, provided promises were fulfilled. We usually think of the working classes of Petrograd and Moscow because of a great Russian bias. However, strikes and demonstrations were not uncommon in Warsaw, Kiev, Vilnius, Baku, and Minsk. Farther east, there were smaller strikes and demonstrations because of smaller industrialized populations, but they did exist. Typically against, of course, the bad working hours, the bad working conditions, and everything else negative they were experiencing in context of the war. However, minorities in general tended to be a bit more resistant to the Bolsheviks because they were dealing with more immediate problems, such as German occupation, or they resented the Great Russian and sometimes Jewish names of Bolshevik leadership. If peace only meant the cessation of war, the Germans brought it. The Germans also allowed new distribution of communal land or supported private ownership in areas that they occupied. And with the cessation of war, planting and harvesting ensured bread. So the Bolsheviks certainly had their work cut out for them in minority areas. While Lenin signed a decree on the rights of self-determination for all peoples, there was the belief that he didn't mean it because of the war situation. Sitting in Smolny in November of 1917, there was really little the Bolsheviks could do about that belief. Allowing self-determination simply recognized the current situation, and many of the members of what became Sovnarkom hoped might sway nationalities towards the Bolsheviks because German occupation was still German occupation rather than indigenous rule. Germany held Poland, Lithuania, parts of Ukraine, and much of Belarusia. After the failed armistice in December, the Germans pressed eastward, taking the rest of Belarusia and Ukraine, defeating its Russian Bolshevik government, and added Latvia and Estonia. Turkey took Armenia. Finland, Azerbaijan, and Georgia seceded. These minorities, however, had never been happy under the Tsars and had been eager to escape the Great Russians, regardless of their political outlooks. And we're familiar with this because many of those new nations also had Bolshevik leaders of their own that attempted either to take control or became parts of governments in one way or another. By the mid-1920s, many of these groups returned to the Great Russian majority, but that's outside the scope of this lecture at this time. Right away, the loss of these workers and peasants was a huge problem for the Bolsheviks. As the German zone moved eastward, Russia lost 33% of its factories, 26% of its railroads, 73% of its iron industry, and 75% of its coal fields. It lost 60 million people, and out of 165 million, that's almost 40%. For a political party that depended upon a proletariat, that was a problem. This tied back to the worker issue. If there are no inputs or markets for industrial workers, they cannot work. That's kind of obvious. As the Bolsheviks found, when workers cannot work, they cannot earn pay. If they have no pay, they can't afford food, fuel, and rent. And then they get angry. Even workers' control could not fix the goods famine. Instead, factories paid workers for not working, but then many ran out of payroll. Lenin and Sovnarkom responded by eliminating money. Unfortunately, factories were unprepared to exchange with each other and supply other workers with goods because they did not have the goods. Russian workers and peasants were already relying on barter. The elimination of money did not eliminate their problems finding food and fuel. And so many workers actually fled back to the mirs, the small communes, farming communes from which they came. Peasants had always been an imperial problem, and thus became a problem for the Bolsheviks. The peasantry was 80% of the population. It was barely above subsistence level, so it produced little. Its poverty provided a limited market, though its size helped assuage that for industrial workers. The Great Russian peasantry believed that they were ordained by God to work the land in common, redistributing land among mere members when necessary. No one could leave the Mir unless absolutely necessary. It took permission from the eldest members to do so. Peasants made up the majority of soldiers and sailors and of part-time and full-time workers. By 1917, the peasantry was, to quote vernacular, pissed off. Lenin hoped to harness some of the peasantry's passion and to reduce its reliance on the Eseri, the socialist revolutionaries, which were a peasant Marxist group, by passing the land decrees mentioned above, as well as by passing the decree on working the land. Anyone could hold land, though without private title, provided they worked it. Being passed after harvest and during snow, this decree meant little. Spring, however, demonstrated the decree's unintended consequences, as peasants still unaffected by civil war all but warred themselves over the best pieces of land, as Lenin and Sovnarkom encouraged them to improve their communes. Engels had said that the communal system of the Russian peasants could provide a model for the West, if the peasants could get out of their parochial mindset. In November of 1917, that had not yet happened, and it appeared it might be difficult to achieve. While the peasants were happy with the Bolsheviks' redistribution of land, including church lands, they were less happy with Sovnarkom's decrees against religion and in favor of reforming societal norms. The new laws regarding divorce were particularly frowned upon by many older men within the Mirs who found themselves then confronted by unhappy families. Sovnarkom hoped to quickly modernize the peasants, but did not realize the challenges of quickly modernizing the 16th century mindset. Fortunately for the Bolsheviks in late 1917, the majority of Russian peasants seemed ready for a change, if only to improve their own lots. This was, however, a short-term alliance. Even government clerks and other lower bureaucrats were agitating for change. Inflation and war had hit them hard as well. Pay was becoming sporadic, and they chafed at the traditional slights that were supposed to disappear with democracy. Beyond the lowest jobs within the government, janitors, guards, and office managers, few bureaucrats were interested in the details of the Bolsheviks' ideology. They were willing to listen to the Bolsheviks' promises of peace and bread. Because of their ideological indifference, they were one of the most difficult audiences for the new political leaders. While Marx stated that under socialism government would begin to wither away, the Russian bureaucracy had no intention of disemploying itself. The Bolsheviks did not have nearly enough trained party members to conduct the day-to-day business of running a nation the size of Russia, even with 60 million people being lost. There were not a large number of Bolshevik accountants, city planners, and communications directors. Bukharin may have known a lot about Marx, but he didn't know squat about running a railroad. Bolsheviks tended to be thinking men. Their practical knowledge of work was limited. Thus, the Bolsheviks quickly found themselves relying upon Tsarist officials in such areas as transportation, communication, and to a lesser extent, foreign trade. They were not simply relying upon friendly elements, meaning Bolsheviks and their sympathizers. They were relying on men who had belonged to the gentry, church, and business world before November 1917. Even after a major sweep that removed many class enemies from the bureaucracy, 57% of all experts in one commissariat, equivalent to a cabinet membership in the US federal government, came from Tsarist times. Of all the difficulties the Bolsheviks faced, this became one of the most significant. As Lenin stated, quote, "We took over the machinery of state, and that was our misfortune. Down below, there are hundreds of thousands of workers we got from the Tsar," end quote. Workers and peasants can and did respond to violence, but the state apparatus, as part of the state, holds the monopoly on violence, and it is loath to use it against itself. Even Stalin eventually found it easier to control peasants than to control the bureaucracy. Finally, while the Bolsheviks assumed that world revolution would follow November 1917, the rest of the world cooperated little. The Weimar government squashed Germany's communist revolution in 1919. Romania destabilized the Hungarian Soviet Republic in 1919, and communist parties throughout Europe and the Americas failed to capitalize upon the Bolshevik success. Furthermore, by spring 1918, the Mensheviks decided the dustbin of history was too confining, and they joined forces with the rightist Eseri constitutional Democrats, also known as cadets, and other assorted liberals, military, and monarchic groups to overthrow the Bolsheviks, plunging Russia once more into war. Revolution was the easy part. Consolidating the revolution and instituting permanent Marxist changes would not be. I told you I'd limit it to 15 minutes. Mike?
ultimately easier in terms of control and getting things done? Did he want something else, but eventually even he just became a dictator?
Oh, is there a format? Sorry.
Well, it's really lecturer's prerogative. I would just say I was going to address it as a theoretical question, but
Oh, I mean, I can sit down and we can
Either
have
way.
others. Go ahead.
we want to just have a formal discussion or informal discussion.
Yeah.
Oh,
Well, I guess what I would say is Lenin's major theory on seizing the state comes from state and revolution. Basically, his analysis of the state is as follows. He sees it as a mechanism by which one class oppresses another class. So under current capitalist conditions, the capitalist class uses it to suppress the workers by breaking up strikes, just all around, things like that. And so what Lenin wanted to do with seizing the state was to actually invert that and use the, which is commonly referred to as the dictatorship of the proletariat, which in this case he would use it to suppress the bourgeoisie class. And then this is where Marx, specifically Lenin mentions it, once that's done, the state would wither away. And given the actual revolutionary theory of that, Mao actually has a rebuttal to this. He says, look, the bureaucratic party state eventually becomes a danger itself, and then there needs to be a second revolution to take out that.
And so what happened was Lenin intended for that system, but as he found out he couldn't run the railroads, he couldn't run the communication lines and everything else, he had to rely on those who could. And as a result, they ended up seriously compromising the revolution that he had intended Russia to have. It never happened.
Well,
Go ahead.
the cliche, of course, is that in almost all revolutions, the person who takes power simply becomes equivalent to what was there before.
Yeah, and in many ways, I think that the hanging order for the kulaks, Trotsky's control of the Red Army and its war against the peasants and such, certainly convinced many within and outside Russia that Lenin had become a dictator, rather than raising the dictatorship of the proletariat to the position that it needed to be raised to.
Well, I would say that Lenin had a lot on his hands at that time too. Basically most of Russia was pretty much occupied by white Russians at the point, almost directly following. And if you think of Moscow and how big Russia is, this much is what was under Bolshevik control. And so it seems to me that, basically the dividing parties for this particular area of the world were Ukrainian black anarchists under Makhno, who basically were loose-knit bandits who didn't really contribute a whole lot of good. The white Russians, who basically wanted a new aristocracy, a new monarchy. I'm pointing to you so I can tell these. Or the Bolsheviks.
Or the SRA.
But
And most of the peasants supported the SRA throughout the revolution.
So given the fact that the white Russians themselves were basically bloodthirsty and looking to basically, again, replace the monarchy, and they were supported by all of the entire world, given support from all the allies, including Japan, France, America, and everyone else.
Czechoslovakia, Japan.
Right. So basically the entire war declared war on the Bolshevik state. So, and to say that Lenin would be equivalent to the Tsar, I think that I would disagree with that. I don't think the Tsar could in any way be compared to what Lenin was trying to do.
Why not?
Simply because the Tsar, again, a long line of lineage of just royal families that build cities in their own image, when Lenin's trying to actually emancipate the working class rather than oppress them. And granted, yeah, it didn't work out, I admit this, but I think there's a difference.
Roger?
Dr. Brown, you were mentioning about the fact that a lot of the peasants, the farmers, were still in the 16th century mindset with the cutoff of money, of specie. How much did that really affect them? Was that a big shock to them because they started getting into a more modern economy? Or was it the fact that they just took a step backwards into something that was comfortable and familiar and really not much of a burden for the communities outside the cities?
It affected a minority of them. There was about 10% of the peasants had become what were known as kulaks, almost independent farmers who could afford to pay workers to work on their land and do things like that. They were definitely affected by the reduction in specie because they weren't getting trade from the cities as much. The Mirs themselves, particularly those outside black soil regions, were not as heavily affected. When you get up to areas like Arkhangelsk and things like that, specie had never been a massive part of their lives. Most of it went to the government in order to pay excise taxes on things like kerosene that they couldn't produce themselves. So many of them just went back to torches and things that they did during times of famine when they couldn't afford to give the specie to the state, but had to keep it in order to pay for food instead. So, we're talking about a population that under the Tsars is basically waiting for their dogs to die so that they can tan them and turn them into boots. Barter remained pretty important.
So other than the fact that they were starving to begin with, it was not an uncomfortable transition to step back away from the species because it's what they had known for hundreds of years.
Yeah, it was, it was kind of as if, I think, in the United States, if the Depression generation had gone back to the Depression in the 1950s or something, they would have been prepared for it because it was certainly within their collective memory.
Quick question.
Oh, yeah.
I once heard that there was a quote by Lenin where he said that communism and socialism is just a rung on the ladder to capitalism. Do you think that that could have actually been his goal, that could be an accurate quote from him? Because I don't remember what I heard.
To go to capitalism?
Yeah. On the way to capitalism.
No.
That doesn't seem like...
No, I think he must have been misquoted. I mean, during NEP, the new economic policy, he allowed some capitalism to exist again so that he could build up Soviet, what became at that point, Soviet factories in order to compete with capitalism. So it's kind of a couple steps back, but not necessarily to get into capitalism
But he's
itself.
not progressive for it.
No, not going to.
Lenin's two major economic policies, because he dies in 1924, right? First was war communism, and this was specifically instilled to deal with the Civil War and the encroachment of the imperialist armies. It involved things like seizure of all railroads, all state factories, everything like this, under literally dictatorship. And again, keeping the framework of what the word dictatorship, where it comes from, it's actually a Republican thing going back to Rome. When Cincinnatus, who we have a city named Cincinnati named after, was a dictator. Rome basically came in and said, hey, guess what? We need you to defend Rome. And this is something he did at great expense to himself, because literally all he wanted to do was plow his fields and live out his life. But he actually does this at great personal loss, goes and defends Rome, and doesn't take anything from the Republic at all. He doesn't take any of the treasure, he just simply defends Rome, abdicates his dictatorship, provincial powers, and goes back and plows his fields. And I would actually ask the question, are you familiar with Lenin's last testament to the Central Committee, Catherine? Okay, obviously.
It would be
It's not meant
rude
to
say
insult
duh,
us. It's
right?
not meant to insult you, but right. He calls for an expansion of the bureaucratic class of the CC, more seats or whatever. So, I mean, do you think this? I have a reading of this as in order to get rid of the state, in order to absolve the state, right? Because it's an antagonism between two classes at this point. Do you think he's trying to take the proletariat class and make it more, bring it more up to speed, as with the actual thinking classes you mentioned in the lecture?
He definitely was trying to get the working classes and the peasant classes up to speed with the intellectual classes. I think practically we can see this in his efforts to reform the entire alphabet and the literacy campaigns, the Agitprop campaigns and everything. So yeah, if that's then reflected in his actual writings, absolutely. He had already been doing that. To keep that going would be a no-brainer. He needed a well-prepared, well-trained proletariat in order to outcompete capitalists, whether it's under war communism, which Trotsky would have been happy with, or under the NEP, which Bukharin was happy with. Bukharin was particularly interested in getting the peasants up to speed so that they would lose that parochial mindset that I talked about in the lecture, and thereby serve as an example for other countries later. Kevin, you can take your question.
Yeah, I guess for me, it has to do with Mark's understanding that he thought with being an industrial nation that we fell. Russia, from my understanding at this time, is not. How can I legitimize a Bolshevik revolution in the country he's capable of holding that revolution? It should have been the US or the UK. Maybe even Germany.
Preferably Germany. I mean, you've got a socialist democratic party, a communist party in Germany that's even larger than that of the Russians at this point, in a smaller population. So yeah, I think Marx fully intended it would happen in those places first. Russia was not seen as particularly ready for anything. Engels kind of changed his attitude towards the end of his life, but again, it was tied to the communal system that he believed the peasants would have to get rid of their parochialism before they could move forward into socialism. And of course, that failure to get rid of the parochialism kind of doomed the hopes that it would be purely Marxist revolution in the first place. Barry?
Did Lenin get around to purging enemies of the state before he died, or did he just leave that to Stalin because he died young?
Oh no, there were a variety of чистки, as they're known, sweeps, where they tried to get enemies of the state out of their bureaucracy, but oftentimes they were rehired within 6 months to a year because they were necessary for their expertise. So there were efforts to get rid of them, and some of them were quite effective. I mean, you have huge numbers of the aristocracy and the church emigrate to places like the United States and France and even to Germany and farther west to the United States. But there still remained large numbers of the old classes within Russia, and they were dealt with sometimes violently if part of the White Army and captured, and sometimes not so violently. Sometimes they were simply given a paycheck if they were useful. Oh, we've blown.
There's a question on my trying to capture it. Well, I would point out, given the historical, at this point, Russian revolutions in general, right? The French Revolution and the Paris Commune, they've always come under attack. And so we see excessive measures always taken to defend them. Less so in the Paris Commune, more extreme in the French Revolution itself. But even nowadays, even if you think more contemporary revolutions in Latin America have always come under scrutiny, as well as more or less coups, given how they age.
Absolutely.
So I guess I would say, where's my question going with this? Do you see them as being, really, was it more or less like pure chaos the entire time, or was it more of a control that Lenin was trying to maintain as in trying to guide it? Because obviously there's various conflicting forces going on. Do you see it as them trying to like, being really panicky about the whole situation of like, oh, now we're being invaded, oh, now we have this, now this, or do you think they were sort of probably...
I think they kind of assumed, because they had just come out of that war, that there would be backlash. I think the first sign of that was when the West basically began to cry out at the dissolution of debt agreements between Russia and France and Russia and the UK and such. So that Lenin knew from that point on that he was going to face a hostile West. That revolution likely was not going to be immediate in these countries. And I think they prepared for it a bit. I think giving Trotsky control of the Red Army, for example, demonstrates that, because he was ruthless. And so, like in anything, whether it's our own daily lives or what Obama's doing or what Sarkozy's doing or even Lula is doing down in Brazil, ruling is partially preparing for what you think is going to happen and responding to what actually is happening. And Lenin was caught doing that, along with the rest of Sovnarkom. We don't want to give anybody the impression that Lenin is ruling on high. Sovnarkom and he, the leaders in Sovnarkom and he, get into it quite a bit at many times. To say that he is the only one guiding this revolution at this point would be fallacious. Barry?
When year did Lenin and Trotsky split?
Well, they had their differences. They remind me of best friends that just needle each other on basic things, occasionally. And they're not best friends. That would be wrong to claim. But Lenin really respected Trotsky and what he thought about revolution, but he also really trusted somebody like Bukharin, who was the total opposite of Trotsky. And he believed that this kind of debate, provided it didn't fall into factionalism, this kind of debate was actually healthy for the revolution, because they needed to sort out what were the best potential outcomes for the revolution. They realized that they had been thinking a lot, and they had to get into the practicalities. And with both men debating this around him, those practicalities could be discussed much better than otherwise. The big split, I would argue, came when Lenin chose the NEP over war communism. He basically put Bukharin, calling him even the ideological head of the revolution, ahead of Trotsky. And Trotsky, who, now this may be a surprise to many people, Trotsky, who as a political leader enjoyed limelight, didn't really appreciate being replaced by Bukharin. It hurt his ego, and it hurt Lenin's ego to be told by Trotsky that he was wrong. So you have a falling out over that, although it did not destroy their relationship at all, as Lenin's testimony would demonstrate.
Well, on the Trotsky note, one of Trotsky's main policies was simply to take revolution and basically take the Red Army and use it as a liberating force. And they tried to take Poland, and it didn't work out so well for them. And so this is where...
Now, Poland squished them,
yeah.
which was very bad.
Yeah.
When you get spanked by the Polish army, it's embarrassing.
Yeah, that's true. But I guess this demonstrates, though, again, when Lenin dies, basically he leaves... Well, he leaves actually all... He basically names Trotsky his successor. But again, given the problematics of Trotsky's leadership, this is why Stalin ends up taking over.
And Stalin didn't tell Trotsky that the funeral was happening. So Trotsky didn't get to show up, and Stalin was able to say, Trotsky wouldn't even come to his funeral. How could he possibly be an heir to Lenin?
Was Stalin, as opposed to Lenin, was Stalin just the ultimate cynic when it came to consolidating power? Was Lenin more an idealist and much more than Stalin?
I think Stalin was more opportunistic than Lenin. Stalin had basically seen which way the wind had blown his entire life. It didn't mean he wasn't a Marxist. I mean, he wrote plenty on Marxism, so I mean, we can look at that. I'm not so sure how much of it he wrote himself, but that's for me and the Stalinists to discuss, I guess. But as the head of basically HR for the political party, he was able to put people into power that agreed with him. Trotsky and Bukharin were so weak at doing that. They were more ideological. They really did look for the bigger picture. Stalin looked for the day-to-day ruling. And as a result, as the opportunities came along, he was able to put himself into power more and more, create factions without calling them factions because factionalism was bad, against Trotsky and then against Bukharin, against a whole bunch of other former members of Sovnarkom, and eventually just basically take power ultimately for himself, where he created a regime, I think, that most people would agree was not particularly Marxist. Okay?
How heavily industrialized was Russia at the revolution, at the end of the revolution? Was it pretty well depleted, or was it heavily industrialized to begin with?
It was kind of by the end of the revolution. If we actually go to 1917, by the beginning of NEP, the Russian Revolution and German occupation, and the Civil War, more importantly, had destroyed much of Russia's industrial base. In 1921, I'm trying to get the figures right out of my head, but I think the iron industry was at 7% of what it was in 1914, and in 1914, it sunk. You know, so it was really bad then. The numbers of population that had died at that point had been put up to somewhere between 1914 and 1921. Around 30 million is the highest estimate. The lowest estimate is like 15 million, but they didn't keep particularly good numbers on this. So you have a lot of workers that have died during this time, a lot of peasants. The steel production was about the same level as the iron production, but more importantly, draft animals, which we don't think of as an important thing. In Russia, that's what the economy relied on. Draft animals had been destroyed by 2/3, which literally meant that men had to harness themselves and their wives to pull the plows. And it's hard, it's hard to break ground when you're doing that sort of thing. So the actual status of the Russian economy and industrialization was far worse than it was when the war had broken out in the first place. Roger?
Now, was this a steady decline of industrialization from 1914 to, was it 21 that you said?
Mm-hmm.
Or was it exponential after 1917 with the Germans coming in and the revolutions and all that?
When the Germans would come into factory areas, they would blow up the factories anyway. So it was across the board. I don't know how steady it was, to tell the truth, but it was pretty significant across the board. And then, the White Army would blow up factories that the Bolsheviks had got running. The Bolsheviks would blow up factories that the White Army had gotten running. So it was just a mess.
But it was destroyed by outside forces and not from a decline of need within.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, it was destroyed by war.
So had the Germans not come in and destroyed factories, then we have seen a rise like we do in the U.S. Anytime we go to war, we tool up, we see our industrial output skyrocket.
I
We
don't
see-
know, because Civil War might have destroyed it then. I'm just thinking of like, you know, the U.S. Civil War with the limited factories in Richmond, for example. Most of those were blown to shreds. And I'm imagining the same thing would have happened, but I don't know.
I guess what I'm asking is, though we did, before we saw the Civil War, before the occupation, were we seeing a rise of industrialization in the
yeah.
nation?
Oh, yeah, oh gosh, between 1880 and 1914, it was growing anywhere from 5 to 7% per annum under the Tsarist regime. However, it was still slow. I mean, 5 to 7% sounds like huge growth, but when you're at such a low level as the Russian economy already was, it still was not catching up even with places like France, which was not as high as Germany or Great Britain at that point. But it was growing. Kevin?
I guess along those lines, my understanding is that kind of industrial growth doesn't happen again for Russia till about the 30s.
Under Stalin, it happened again.
Yeah, but to get it, it was off of grain sell-off to the West in order to buy not only the manufacturing equipment, but tooling, things like now make the equipment with.
Right, part of it was because they were just getting the products into machinery making, which was the big thing. There's a lot of growth because of machinery making, and then as those machines come online, there's a lot more industrial growth. There were some high periods of industrial growth under NEP, but after Lenin's death, there were further and further harsher laws that restricted economic trade within the country, and that significantly reduced the economic growth.
I guess my follow-up of that is that I have a hard time legitimizing any communist regime. And in order for Stalin to industrialize like he did, he murdered millions of the peasantry. The proletariat are the ones that bear the brunt of the revolution, if I understand correctly.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at something like the Stakhanovite movement and such, I mean, they were certainly bearing the brunt of it. Of course, most of them were murdered because the other workers hated them. But the workers took it on themselves, or it was put upon them. They had these things called subotniki, where you volunteered your Saturday to build the factory or whatever, and not volunteering your Saturday was a very bad thing to do. Absenteeism was punished harshly, whether it was the subotnik or a regular day of the week. So yeah, certainly the workers were not given great living conditions under the Stalinist regime.
I guess because I'm hung up with this grain sell-off in the Ukraine.
Oh, right, because of the Holodomor. Uh-huh.
I murder millions through starvation so that I can buy equipment.
Mhm.
That's
Yeah.
a plan.
It's a plan. It worked for the Tsars too.
Yeah.
A lot of industrial growth happened under the Tsars that way as well.
I would say, what were Russia's actual material resources they had to exchange? And from what I read, I can't remember the precise article where I found it, but in the U.S. and other nations actually put an embargo and imposed it on them, but only allowed grain to be exported and traded. Is that true, or?
No, not entirely true. I did my dissertation on part of this, so this is fun for me. I know, it's great. But coal, for example, with Scandinavia trade freely. China trade freely.
China's going communist, or wants to turn to be communist.
Not until the 1940s.
49. Well,
You
yeah, I
know.
guess Chiang Kai-shek was one power.
Yeah, exactly. Persia was still doing a lot of trade. The British were trading with Russia, even though there was the embargo, there was a lot of smuggling. France was doing a lot of smuggling as well. Germany was trading, of course, after the First World War significantly. Heck, they were trading troops at this point. And Germany was getting a lot of material, particularly coal, huge amounts of coal from the Soviet Union. Iron, steel, even basic machinery that the Germans would sometimes even melt down and turn into better machinery because of the low quality coming from the Soviet Union. But the Soviet Union did not have a problem, even with the embargo from the United States and a bit from the UK, the Soviet Union did not have a problem after World War I building up some of its trade routes because Germany needed the trade so desperately. Eric, excuse me.
Yes, I want to talk about the grain sell-offs. I'm a little hung up on that
Oh,
also.
you and Kevin, huh?
When they sell the grain off, did Stalin understand what would happen, that he condemned people to starvation? Or did he care?
I don't know. I mean, he knew that it would create problems for the peasantry, but he thought that the peasantry could overcome those problems if they would only work harder. So if they would produce more, the amount that was taken from them would not be as significant. But again, this Stalin taking the grain from the peasants was not Stalinist, it was Russian. Trotsky had done it during 1918 and 1919 with the Red Army, and the Tsars had done it for centuries in order to get goods abroad from the West. Russia has always been a supplier economy. It still is a supplier economy. It wonders why it can't compete with the West, and it's because you can't build an economy on beechwood and oil. You have to have finished goods, and Stalin basically put his money on the grain and the unfinished products of the Soviet Union in order to make it money, rather than building up trade in finished goods that would have gotten him much more money in the long run.
On Stalin, right, I don't divide, right, it was definitely massive amounts of deaths, but one of Stalin's major policies was to liquidate the kulak class, and I believe the word kulak translates to tight fist in Russian.
Fist, just fist,
Okay.
like a crushing fist.
Right, but essentially what the kulaks were, they were pretty much the bosses of the peasantry, in a sense. They hired them on, they exploited their labor. And so one of the reasons why some of the worker peasants actually ended up supporting the Bolsheviks as well as, I won't say Stalin, but was the fact that they promised them land reforms to actually break up these sort of kulak hold on the area and basically collectivize all the land and turn it into collective farms. Now, the kulaks obviously resisted this, and this is even cited in the Black Book of Communism. They resisted this by withholding grain, refusing to grow grain, and slaughtering their animals, and just sabotaging tractors and other state machinery. So I guess the ultimate question is what is the significant cause of the famine? Aside from just, let's blame it on the weather.
Most of the kulaks had actually been eliminated during the revolution itself. By 1930, during collectivization, a kulak could be anyone who owned a silver spoon. It could be anyone who owned furniture. Rather, a chair could have you condemned as being a kulak. There are thousands, literally in the archive, thousands of examples of people who are condemned as kulaks because simply they were unliked by other members. It was very much a Salem witch trial sort of experience. To suggest that all of these people who were condemned as kulaks were actually holding power over others in their communities is ridiculous. It's not accurate in any shape, way, or form. The real reason for the famine is because, one, the machine tractor stations were never delivered. They could not harvest, plant, whatever, without the machine tractor stations. The tractors that they were typically sent were so poorly put together by the workers that they were unusable. You needed 3 tractors to make one working tractor. That's a significant problem. Another problem is the killing of the draft animals. If the peasants kill their draft animals, or the animals are killed to teach the peasants a lesson, as often happened as well, they can't plow. They have to hook up their women and children to the plows. Stalin certainly didn't have a problem with that. Right? Orlando Figes has written quite a bit on the famine, and it's not just weather. It was a man-made famine throughout much of Russia, either because of Stalin's policies, and not him particularly. To blame Stalin alone would be incredibly wrong. Stalin would say he wanted something done, and the lickspittles below him would then emphasize what he wanted done and amplify it, so that they would create even more chaos as it went farther and farther down the line. So that if you wanted to be promoted within your cadre, you had to, if your boss said, give me 15% of the people who are kulaks, who might be kulaks, you would say 25% would be even better, because that would get you a promotion. It could get you out of some places backwards as Rostov, and maybe sent to Kiev or sent to Moscow. These were opportunists as well. Stalin was an opportunist, and the people he put into power relied on him for their assistance. So the famine was because of these man-made issues, as well as the peasants killing their own livestock. Roger?
So was it trade then with Germany after the war that was able to reestablish the industrial base in Russia so that they were prepared for World War II?
To some extent, but it was also just the needs of the nation itself. As more and more areas came back, as the Ukraine returned, as Georgia returned, the Caucasus, everybody needed stuff. So the Baku oil fields started moving again, so that the textile industry outside of Moscow could develop. The Russian food production program started developing again. Everything started in order to feed and supply the Russian people, as well as the Germans, the Scandinavians, and anyone else who would trade with them.
So governmental and military stability that the country allowed to grow.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Did Lenin have any proposals as to what to do with the rebellious provinces that wanted independence, like Finland?
Well, there wasn't too much there's what he wanted and what he could do. Reality and belief often collide, right? So he wanted Finland to come back, but by that point, with Finland's independence, there wasn't really much he could do about it. Some have tried to argue poorly that the Soviet effort in the Winter War in 1939-1940 was an effort to bring Finland back into the old borders of the Russian Empire, but it wasn't very effective. I'm not sure exactly what Lenin's thinking was on Finland, just because I abandoned that section when I started focusing on trade. They did trade with Finland, though.
Were these rebellious provinces afraid of Marxism? Is that what or did they just see the opportunity to flee the Poland?
Oh, the latter. You mean right after the revolution?
Yeah.
Oh, the Finns were particularly eager to flee because they had been so hard hit during the revolution of 1905. So they didn't care who was sitting in St. Petersburg. As long as they could get away from them, they were happy regardless of the background. And Finland, of course, had its dalliances with communism and socialism and other political parties. But in the end, I think we know which way Finland went, since it let the Germans sit on its soil in 1940. They decided the right was farther to their liking.
So we have any further questions or comments or anything that you want to address?
I guess a comment. I'm struggling with Stalin because I know I read somewhere before the Politburo, he does say the Ukrainians are going to die and basically says good riddance. And I've seen two statements and my brain has.
Find them.
You can see the smoke coming out.
If you find them for me, I'll have my contacts in Moscow's archives, look them up, and we'll find out.
I will try and
I'd love to see the ones too.
I would like to see, because I don't have any recollection of him being so specific that way, but if he is, I would love to see it.
Just a couple of events we have going on this week. Wednesday, we're having a friend from the Freedom Road Socialist Organization come and talk about the economic crisis and what it's done to education rights.
The what organization?
Freedom Road Socialist Organization.
Oh.
He's from North Carolina. But they're just going to talk about how basically the economic crisis has had a lot of budget cuts, and usually this comes first in education. So women's programs go, any type of minority studies programs, usually the first to go, as well as people just have hard times getting into college. So he'll be here in this room at 1 o'clock on Wednesday. We'll also have a table for the RSU all day that day on Wednesday in PE concourse. So maybe wants to come up and talk politics. And then that night we'll actually have Josh Sykes, who's coming and talk about the talk here on one. He'll be presenting to the RSU meeting that night at 8 o'clock, which I haven't looked through yet. I apologize. But he'll be talking about the Freedom Road Socialist Organization. So that's just what's going on. I do have a sign-up sheet if anybody wants to get emails from the RSU. If you enjoy a conversation like this and learning about history and theory, that's essentially what we do in the RSU every week. I thank Kat Brown for her time today and appreciate you all for coming out.